Guard veteran, her father, and the room goes ice cold. He doesn't say a word. He doesn't have to. In a matter of seconds, a political takedown turns into a national gut punch about race, sacrifice, and the brutal weight of silence. What did America finally see in that moment? And why has no one been able to forget it since? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Washington, D.C. Inside Studio 4B of Voices of America, the air was tight, electrified. A live audience of 300 sat beneath cold lights, every lens rolling for a national broadcast. On the main screen, the night's question pulsed in bold white. Is America too sensitive about race and politics? It wasn't a question, it was bait. The room wasn't built for comfort, it was built for confrontation. Karoline Leavitt stepped onto the stage like a verdict already written. Red blazer, practiced smirk, eyes sharp with strategy. She didn't hesitate. She didn't soften. She took her seat with the confidence of someone used to applause before the sentence was even finished. Her charm was a weapon, polished, market-tested, and ready to draw blood. She wasn't here to debate. She was here to dominate. Then Jasmine Crockett walked in. No smile, no nod, just purpose. Clad in black, silver cross resting against her collarbone, she moved like still water, controlled, composed, watchful. She didn't scan the crowd. She didn't look for approval. She sat without performance, without apology. The host cleared his throat. Tonight, he said, we ask whether identity politics is dividing America or finally giving it voice. But the real question hung unspoken. What happens when the room realizes one guest came to talk, and the other came with something far heavier, truth and a witness to carry it? The lights never flickered, but something colder crept into the studio. Just as Karoline parted her lips with the kind of smile that doesn't warm a room, only sharpens it. I think America's had enough of symbolic politics, she said, her tone polished, her delivery effortless, like someone repeating a line she'd rehearsed in front of a mirror too many times to count. We need real leaders, people chosen for their work ethic, not their skin tone. The words glided across the studio floor like oil over glass, smooth, shiny, and deeply flammable. She didn't look at Jasmine when she said it. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew who the comment was aimed at. And Karoline? She sat back slightly as if proud she'd said what others were too polite or too afraid to voice. It wasn't an outburst. It was a controlled burn, the kind that doesn't leave ashes right away, but leaves something much worse, a lingering silence. A ripple of laughter rose from the audience. Not full-throated, not joyous, but the kind of laugh that comes from people who feel protected by power, who believe cruelty becomes wisdom if you say it calmly enough. A few clapped. Others glanced around to see if they should. The host, sitting 3 feet from Jasmine, gave a neutral smile and moved his thumb to the next cue card. No challenge, no redirect, no acknowledgement that the line had crossed a line. Because in that room, the wound wasn't visible, not yet. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't move. Her shoulders remained square, her chin level. No sigh, no scoff, no counterattack. She'd learned a long time ago that some rooms didn't deserve her anger. That silence, when wielded right, cuts deeper than noise. But her silence wasn't passive. It held. It stretched. It filled the space Karoline thought she had claimed. And still, Jasmine's eyes didn't shift toward her. Instead, they stared just past the lens of the camera, as if she saw something the audience hadn't caught yet. That's when the camera turned. Just a beat. Not planned, not signaled. Just a slow pan across the third row. A man sat there barely moving, dressed in a gray military dress coat worn soft at the shoulders. His hands were clasped over one knee, his back straight, his jaw still. On his chest, a faded bronze star and a U.S. Army insignia, dulled not from neglect, but from years of use. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just looked, straight ahead, toward the woman who had just suggested his daughter didn't earn her seat. His silence wasn't hesitant. It was deliberate. The silence of someone who had held dying soldiers in his arms and now had to sit here and watch his child be dressed down with a sentence wrapped in civility. The camera cut away, too quickly, but the image had already landed. That man wasn't a guest. He wasn't on the run of show. But for those few seconds, he became the gravity of the room. He was the contradiction Karoline hadn't calculated, the part of the story she thought would stay silent. He had bled for a flag that now sat behind her on LED screens, and he had raised a daughter who'd made it into rooms like this only to be told, on live television, that her presence was decorative. Jasmine still said nothing, but her father's stillness spoke in a language only a few in that audience understood, the language of war, of restraint, of deep generational injustice worn quietly like a uniform. And as the tension climbed, not with shouting, but with stillness, even the laughter in the back row faded. Because something had shifted, something real had entered the room, and it did not laugh back. The silence should have settled the room, but Karoline wasn't interested in quiet. She wanted a reaction, and she was willing to cut deep to get it. She shifted in her chair, leaned in with casual confidence, and delivered the next line as if tossing out a clever aside over wine, not on live national television. "You know," she said, voice light but blade sharp, "I spent years in politics without needing to wear a victim's badge just to get invited to the table." There was no stumble, no hesitation. It was said like a fact, like something reasonable. But it wasn't. It was an accusation disguised as experience, and Karoline knew it. Every syllable was aimed with precision. It didn't need to be shouted to be cruel. It just had to sound calm enough for people to pretend it wasn't. She paused, letting the sentence hang in the air. Sour, heavy, intentional. Then she turned her head toward Jasmine, her eyes locked in like a challenge. "Just a joke, of course," she added almost sweetly. "I'm sure you're strong enough to take a little joke, right?" The room didn't laugh this time. Not fully. A few low chuckles floated from the back rows, then died quickly. A sense of discomfort crept across the audience. But no one spoke. No one interrupted. No one stopped the clock. And the host, still seated between them, flipped his cue card as if he hadn't heard what everyone else just had. That was the cruelty of it. It was allowed. Because it came wrapped in irony. Because it didn't break the rules, it bent them just enough to make others complicit. Jasmine didn't move. Her posture held. Her expression didn't shift. No sigh, no eye roll, no rebuttal. But inside her chest, something tightened. Not from pain, she'd felt worse, but from recognition. This was familiar. She had heard variations of this line since her first town hall, her first courtroom, her first classroom. Each version said the same thing. "You're only here because someone needed you to be." And each time she had stayed steady. Because that's what survival looked like in rooms built to test how much you could endure without breaking. But behind her, something subtle shifted. Her father, seated just off camera, leaned forward a fraction of an inch. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was immediate. His fingers, once relaxed across his thigh, closed slowly into a fist. His gaze, which had been still, now narrowed with the sharp clarity of a man who had learned to measure threats, not by volume, but by intention. The insult hadn't been thrown at him, but it might as well have been. Because what Karoline had just said, with a smirk and a shrug, didn't just challenge his daughter's right to speak. It mocked the cost of everything it took for her to get there. He had worn a uniform in foreign deserts, led men through mortar fire, buried comrades under flags. He'd stood for a country that hadn't always stood for him. And now here he was, in the third row of a television studio, watching a woman in red tell his daughter, on air, in front of millions, that her voice was only valid if it could survive ridicule, that her strength wasn't earned, it was expected. And if she didn't laugh along, she'd be seen as weak, emotional, proving the very point they accused her of. Still, he didn't rise, he didn't interrupt, but his silence changed. It became heavier, more intentional, a tension that rolled off him like pressure from a sealed chamber. Anyone watching closely would have seen it, the small, precise movement of his clenched jaw, the steady breath pulled through his nose, the kind of restraint that comes from a lifetime of being forced to carry composure like armor. Because he knew, more than anyone else in that room, that the real danger wasn't in what had been said, but in how easily it had been accepted. And Jasmine? She didn't flinch, because she understood the game. She'd seen it before. The insult delivered with a smile, the silence from the crowd, the test of endurance dressed up as debate. But that didn't make it right. It didn't make it easier. And as she sat there, still, composed, unshaken, she wasn't just holding her own dignity. She was holding his. She was holding theirs. Because there is no medal for grace under fire. No applause for not reacting. But in that moment, her silence was its own kind of strength. A strength built from generations who had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to give them the performance they want. The line between performance and reality had shattered, and now what hung in the air wasn't tension, but reckoning. The studio, moments earlier alive with artificial charm and engineered laughter, had turned still. Not quiet, still. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask for permission. Something had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. The claps had faded, the smirks had stiffened. Even the crew behind the cameras had paused their routine movements, eyes narrowing behind the glass of the control booth. For the first time all evening, the power in the room wasn't coming from the stage. It was pressing in on it. Karoline sat upright, her expression fixed, but something in her body language betrayed the smallest ripple of awareness. Her punchline hadn't landed. It had detonated in a way she hadn't prepared for. The host cleared his throat, but his voice came out thinner than before. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, the words more careful now. "Would you like to respond?" It was meant to be a segue, simple, clean, but it came out like a challenge, like he'd just handed her a live wire and waited to see if she'd flinch. All eyes turned to her, the cameras, the lights, the weight of the room itself. Jasmine didn't speak right away. Instead, she did something so subtle it carried more power than any monologue. She lifted her right hand, the same hand that had been holding her pen the entire time, and placed the pen gently on the glass tabletop. Not dropped, not slammed, placed, with care, with control. Then she exhaled once, slow and deliberate, like she was releasing not just breath, but heat, pressure she had absorbed without permission. And then for the first time that evening, she turned her head, not toward the host, not toward Karoline, but toward the third row. Her eyes found him instantly, as if she'd known he'd be waiting. Her father, still seated in that same upright position, the gray in his beard catching the stage light, the service pin on his chest barely visible now beneath the studio glare. He didn't move when she looked at him, didn't nod, didn't smile. He just looked back, calmly, directly, his gaze carrying more than paternal support. It carried history, carried battles he had never spoken of in public, carried pride tempered by pain, an expectation born from survival. Jasmine held his eyes for only a second, but it was long enough for her to draw something from him. Not instruction, not permission, grounding. And then she gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, yet deliberate. It wasn't a signal of agreement, it was a declaration. I know exactly where I am, and I am ready. He didn't nod back. He didn't need to. Instead, he adjusted nothing, except his gaze, which now slid slowly and without hesitation to Karoline. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't theatrical, but it was unavoidable. The kind of look a soldier gives when he's seen a threat not worth shouting about, but too dangerous to ignore. His hands remained calm on his knees, but one finger flexed. A subtle motion, involuntary, like muscle memory kicking in from a time when he'd had to hold steady while everything around him demanded a reaction. That was the tension now, not between Jasmine and Karoline, but between a father who had bled for a country and a woman who just questioned the legitimacy of the person he had raised. Karoline looked away, only for a moment, but it was enough, because in that instant, the performative energy she'd carried all night, sharp, smiling, rehearsed, collapsed under something heavier. Not because anyone shouted her down, but because the one man in the room who hadn't said a single word had just spoken more truth through stillness than she had with all her carefully chosen lines. And Jasmine? She hadn't said a thing yet, but the room now belonged to her. The room didn't breathe. It waited. And in that stillness, Jasmine chose not to retaliate, but to reveal. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Her voice came low, firm, and unhurried, like a verdict being read aloud for the first time in years. "That man," she said, turning her head just enough to gesture without raising her hand, "is my father." The words cut clean through the stillness. Lieutenant Colonel Isaiah Crockett, U.S. Army, retired. A few heads turned in the audience. Others followed her line of sight. He was still sitting in the third row, in the same position he had held the entire night. Back straight, hands on his lap, eyes forward, calm as stone under pressure. "He served for 26 years, Jasmine continued, led 3 combat tours, decorated for valor, and on his final deployment, he was shot in the chest while rescuing wounded soldiers during a ground ambush in Kandahar." The studio didn't move. You could hear the shift in breathing patterns. People no longer reacting, but absorbing. "He was the one who kept the unit alive," she said. "All 27 men made it home. They survived because he refused to retreat." Her voice remained steady, but the undertone changed. It wasn't pride. It wasn't pain. It was something colder. Memory. "But do you know what he came home to?" Jasmine paused just for a second. "An investigation." The word landed hard. "Because someone claimed he'd given preferential protection to the black soldiers in his unit." Her eyes scanned the studio once, not defiantly, but factually, like a prosecutor laying out an exhibit. There was no proof. There was no violation. But that didn't stop the rumors, didn't stop the threats. It didn't stop someone anonymous to call him, in a letter mailed to our home, a disgrace to the uniform and a black traitor hiding in camouflage. The room tightened. The cameras didn't move. Not yet. They were locked in now, held by something larger than news. Jasmine inhaled slowly, keeping her tone contained. "He fought for a country that let someone write that about him, and no one investigated that." A long pause, then, deliberately, "But tonight he sat quietly and watched a woman suggest that I don't belong here, because someone thought I looked right on paper." Now she turned her body just slightly toward Karoline, not for confrontation, but clarity. "So let me be very clear. He didn't carry a gun through enemy territory, so I could be told I'm a diversity trophy in a red-lit studio." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "He didn't bury friends under American flags, so my worth could be reduced to a checkbox in someone else's culture war." Karoline didn't answer. She couldn't. The smugness on her face had drained into something vacant. Her hands remained folded, but they had lost their energy. Her mouth stayed shut. Not out of strategy, but because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound grotesque under the weight of what had just been spoken. For the first time all night, she looked, not at Jasmine, but downward, toward the table, toward her own reflection in the glass. And then the camera shifted, slowly, silently. As if drawn by gravity itself, it moved to the third row. It found him. Lieutenant Colonel Crockett. He hadn't moved. Still upright, still composed, but now in full focus. A close-up that filled the screen not with flash or drama, but dignity. His jaw was square, his shoulders held with quiet authority. But it was his eyes that told the story. Eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by political theater. Eyes that had once scanned the sand for snipers, and now scanned a studio full of people pretending to be brave. He didn't frown. He didn't cry. He just watched, calm, patient. But beneath that calm was the unbearable weight of recognition, that even after all the uniforms, all the sacrifices, he still had to watch his daughter defend her legitimacy in a room that thought her strength was optional. The camera stayed on him, and it stayed, because there was something about that stillness that the audience, both in the room and across the country, could no longer look away from. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't demanding justice. He wasn't even reacting. He was proving everything, without speaking a word. And suddenly Karoline's entire argument, crafted, rehearsed, delivered with polished ease, began to look like scaffolding built over a fault line. It had held for 10 minutes, but now with nothing more than Jasmine's voice and her father's silence, it began to collapse in real time. And no one, not the host, not the crowd, Not even Karoline herself could stop it. Karoline inhaled sharply, preparing to speak, perhaps to defend herself, perhaps to minimize the damage. But she never got the chance. He stood, no warning, no shift of attention, no words to clear a path. Just a slow, deliberate motion, his palms pressing gently against the tops of his thighs as he rose, inch by inch, like a man who had been sitting not out of weakness, but out of discipline. It wasn't dramatic. There was no flash, no rustling of clothes, no sudden gasp. But somehow the motion carried more force than anything said on that stage all night. 1 second, he was seated like a forgotten name in the credits of someone else's story. The next, he was standing like a verdict had just been delivered, his shoulders squared as if he were still in uniform, his face calm, unreadable. But his eyes, locked on Karoline, spoke with a weight that no script could bear. The coat he wore wasn't fresh or pressed. It bore the quiet scars of time, faded at the elbows, worn soft at the collar, one cuff threadbare where his hand had rested on a rifle for too many years. But it wasn't the fabric that demanded the room's attention. It was the man inside it. There was no anger in his body, no visible contempt. But he was not neutral. He was not silent in spirit. He stood like a man who had lost too much to ever raise his voice over something as trivial as ego. But who would not, under any circumstance, let his daughter stand alone? And the room reacted not with noise, but with paralysis. The audience froze. One woman near the back blinked as if snapping out of a trance, her eyes fixed on him. The host, still seated between the two women, shifted slightly, then stopped, his mouth half open, unable to form a sentence. The boom mic dropped a few inches and hovered. The teleprompter operator stopped scrolling. Someone backstage whispered into a headset, but even that went unanswered, because the truth of what was happening didn't need direction. It didn't need framing. It was the moment. Every camera in the room knew it. Without a cue, the primary lens pushed in, slow, reverent, capturing Crockett's figure not as a spectacle, but as gravity. Every shot before now had been calibrated for drama. This was something else entirely. This was reality asserting itself in a space built to contain performance. Karoline's gaze rose to meet his, and faltered. Only for a second. But it was there. She had spoken so easily just moments earlier, confident, controlled. Now her hands tightened slightly in her lap, the smile long gone, her shoulders drawing in as if realizing, all too late, that this wasn't a debate. This wasn't banter. She wasn't sparring with Jasmine anymore. She was standing inside the full, unrelenting gaze of a man who had outlived bullets, betrayal, and bureaucracy, and who was now silently asking her a single, unforgiving question. Do you still think this is just a joke? And still, he said nothing, because he didn't have to. Every inch of his body told the truth louder than any voice could carry, that there is a cost to casual cruelty, and sometimes the one paying it is sitting just a few feet from the lights. That some men have given their lives for this country in ways that cannot be captured in news cycles or applause breaks. That some battles are not fought with rifles, but with presence. Karoline's words, once sharp, now hung in the air like fragments of something broken. Not debated, not dismantled, unraveled. Not because someone shouted them down, but because the person they tried to erase had stood up, silently, and taken back the space they were meant to occupy. And the entire room, audience, cameras, crew, felt it. No applause, no commentary. Only the long, breathless realization that truth had entered the room, and it did not need a microphone to be heard. And as the cameras slowly pulled back from the man who had stood without a word, Jasmine leaned forward, not to retaliate, but to remind the room what silence had been carrying all along. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't change her posture. But when she spoke, the air in the room thickened again, not with outrage, but with something heavier. Jasmine's tone was composed, almost quiet, but every word was chosen with surgical precision. When someone laughs after saying, "It was just a joke," she began slowly, they forget there are people who've been hearing that line since the day they learned how to speak. There was no anger in her voice, only history. It's said as a way to excuse what can't be explained, to dress up something ugly and something playful, But the people who laugh the hardest are always the ones who've never had to live with the aftermath of that punchline. The room had already stilled, but now it leaned in. You laugh and the world moves on. But for some of us, she continued, that joke doesn't end with a chuckle. It lingers. It carves itself into job interviews, into hospital waiting rooms, into the way we're followed around in department stores. She didn't blink. And into the way my father was treated when he came home in full uniform, bronze star on his chest, and was still told the neighborhood he tried to move into wasn't ready for that kind of change. A ripple of unease moved through the audience. Not disbelief, recognition. My father, she said, nodding subtly toward the third row, served this country longer than I've been alive. And when he returned from Kandahar bleeding from a chest wound, they thanked him with a rejection letter from a realtor who said the house had just gone under contract. Her tone stayed level, but her jaw tensed. Except it hadn't. The sign stayed up for weeks. They just didn't want him living there. Because even in a uniform with a Purple Heart, he was still too black to be a neighbor. No one interrupted. No one dared. And it didn't stop there, she continued, her hands now resting lightly on the edge of the table. He was asked to leave a church 2 years later. A church, mid-sermon. Not for disrupting the service, not for anything he did, but because a white couple complained that his presence made them feel uncomfortable. Her voice didn't rise, but the weight of the moment pushed deeper into the studio. They said it was a misunderstanding, told him it wasn't personal, that they were just trying to preserve the unity of the congregation. You know what that means when you've heard it long enough. The lights above didn't move, but the shadows around Karoline seemed to deepen. Her fingers shifted. Once, then again. A small twitch. A breath pulled slightly too fast. Her shoulders, once straight, began to fold inward. Not dramatically, but enough to feel. She wasn't looking at Jasmine now. She was looking at her own hands, at the smooth surface of the desk. Anywhere but forward. Anywhere but at the man sitting just 3 rows away, whose life she had reduced to background context a few moments earlier. And the first time he brought me here, right here, to this building, Jasmine continued, her eyes scanning the air just above the cameras, he was stopped at the entrance, 3 times. Her voice lowered slightly, not from exhaustion, but control. He had credentials, a visitor badge. He was in a blazer and tie. But the security guard said, and I quote, "You don't look like you're related to a congresswoman." Jasmine paused. He didn't yell, didn't argue, just showed his ID again, and stood there in silence while they called a supervisor. The silence in the room wasn't just thick, it was dense now, pressing in around every corner of the studio like a sealed vault. That's what happens when a joke becomes culture, she said. It stops being funny, and it starts becoming invisible. Because it wears a suit, it carries a smile, it gets delivered in panel discussions and campaign ads and news segments with polite language and just enough sarcasm to get a laugh before it lands. Her eyes moved toward Karoline, not to confront, but to confirm. You say, "Just kidding," and the world lets it go. But my father had to walk through that world, unarmed, every time someone did. Karoline's face had lost all trace of ease. The confident tilt of her head, the crisp posture, the tactical smirk, all gone. What remained was something stripped, raw. Her hand, once holding a pen, was now closed loosely, thumb twitching just slightly against her ring finger. Her gaze never met Jasmine's. It stayed on the table, locked in a kind of inward panic, the kind that comes when you realize you've touched something sacred, and too late, you've realized your hands weren't clean. But Jasmine didn't press the advantage. She didn't lean in, didn't shift tone, didn't savor the silence she had created. She didn't need to, because this wasn't retribution. It wasn't punishment. It was testimony, and the studio had become a courtroom. Not one with walls or judges, but one built on memory, on pain, on all the things this country hides behind decorum and calls progress. Jasmine wasn't trying to win an argument. She was trying to say what had gone unsaid in rooms like this for far too long. And the most powerful part? She was still calm. The silence held like a drawn breath, And then, just as quietly as he had risen, Lieutenant Colonel Crockett sat back down. He didn't sigh. He didn't shift his shoulders or adjust his coat. He simply lowered himself into the seat with the same composure he had stood with, like he was settling into a position he had earned the right to return to. It wasn't submission. It wasn't closure. It was finality, the act of a man who had said everything he needed to say by not saying a single word. The studio felt it immediately, like a string had been plucked inside every chest, low and vibrating, impossible to ignore. The way he folded his hands again on his lap, the way he didn't even glance toward the cameras, the way his body settled without tension. It told everyone watching that what needed to be done had been done, and it had not been for applause. Across the table, Karoline froze. For a moment, it seemed like she might recover, like her well-trained instincts would pull her through. Her lips parted, her shoulders lifted as if to speak, but no words came. The line she had been holding, the rhythm she had so easily danced through earlier, was gone. There was no thread left to follow, nothing clever to reach for. She looked down at the glass table in front of her, eyes darting from her hand to the cue card, then back again, as if somewhere in the reflection she might find a script to hide behind. But the reflection didn't help her now. It showed her what everyone else already saw, that whatever power she thought she had held in this room had slipped from her grasp. Her breath caught, just slightly. It wasn't a gasp, but it wasn't steady either. Her chest rose and fell faster now. Not enough for drama, just enough for truth. She blinked again. Her fingers, once calmly intertwined, now tapped once, twice on the table edge before curling back into her lap. She wasn't under attack. No one had raised a voice, but that's what made it worse. She wasn't being silenced. She was being seen. And suddenly, she didn't know how to carry that visibility. The host, who had been silent far too long, leaned toward his mic, not with the practiced confidence he'd worn at the start of the program, but with a kind of stunned humility. His voice, when it came, cracked slightly under the weight of what had just unfolded. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, more breath than voice, "I think we all need to admit something." He paused, blinked, looked out toward the camera, not for performance, but for accountability. "This is no longer a talk show." Silence. Then he said it. "This is testimony." The words fell like iron into water, slow, deep, irreversible. A few in the crowd nodded. Others sat motionless, eyes forward, hands clasped, and then someone clapped. Once, softly, almost uncertain, not in praise, not in protest, but in acknowledgement, like someone realizing they had just witnessed something they could never unsee. Another clap followed, then another, never loud, never rising into standing ovation, but real, a sound not of celebration, but of reckoning. Karoline didn't look up. She remained still, her hands folded now tightly together, thumbs pressing into each other like a nervous metronome. Her posture had shrunk, not in height, but in confidence. She had faced interviews, debates, panels. She had sparred with politicians, dismantled journalists, walked into hostile rooms and walked out with applause. But not like this. Not against silence. Not against history. Not against a father's gaze and a daughter's truth. The applause wasn't for Jasmine either. It wasn't applause at all, really. It was a sound made by people who didn't know what else to do. A sound that said, "We were here. We heard it. We know it matters." No camera angle could spin that. No post-production could soften it. What had just happened in the room would not become content. It had already become consequence. Lieutenant Colonel Crockett didn't move again. He sat exactly as he had before, hands resting over one knee, back straight, shoulders relaxed. But his stillness was no longer background. It was the room's new axis. People didn't look at him the way they had when the broadcast began. There was no curiosity now, no formality. There was only respect, and the quiet discomfort that came when you realize you may have spent years applauding the wrong people. The host cleared his throat again. "I don't know what else to say," he admitted, and for once that was the right thing to say. Karoline's breathing was audible now, just slightly. Her chest lifted again and again in uneven intervals. She was still trying to find footing, an exit ramp, a sentence, something to reclaim the space she once owned. but there was nothing to reach for. Her message had collapsed in silence. Her presence no longer shaped the room. It was shrinking within it. And the longer she sat there without speaking, the more people realized that the most dangerous thing she had said tonight wasn't her joke. It was how easily she said it. Jasmine remained composed. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She didn't lean into her opponent's unraveling. She just sat there, present, as if her job had never been to win, but simply to tell the truth and stay standing. And she had done both. Karoline glanced up just once and met Jasmine's eyes for a fleeting second. What passed between them wasn't confrontation. It was something quieter, more painful. The realization that not all silence means surrender, and not all words protect you from the consequences of using them carelessly. The audience wasn't cheering. No one was moved to standing ovation. But something had shifted, something that no one could put back. The applause stopped, not with a cue, but like a candle going out. People lowered their hands, not because they were finished listening, but because they'd heard enough to know the rest was up to them. And in the far corner, an assistant producer, barely out of college, whispered into her headset, "We're off script." There was no reply in her earpiece, because everyone already knew. They weren't just off script. They were finally fully out of denial. What happened in the studio didn't end when the cameras cut. It began quietly in the breath that followed. The clip was only 38 seconds long. No music, no dramatic zooms, no talking heads. Just a still frame of a man standing in a studio while the world finally sat still. It wasn't the kind of video designed to go viral. There were no trending catchphrases, no shout fests, no explosive walk-offs. But what it captured, a man rising without anger, without a word, just presence, cut through the noise like a whisper in a room full of shouting. No caption was needed. People shared it with a sentence, sometimes not even a sentence, just a feeling. This. And from that single moment, a wave began to rise. Slow, quiet, unstoppable. It didn't go viral because of politics. It went viral because of truth. What people saw was more than a father. They saw the cost of being silent for too long, and what it meant to finally be seen. The hashtag appeared within the first hour. The veteran stood. First, it was small accounts, teachers, veterans, young activists with 20 followers and tired hearts. Then it began showing up in the timelines of people who usually never noticed hearings like these. A black high school principal in Philadelphia tweeted, "He stood, and I couldn't sit still for the rest of the day." In Oakland, a grocery store clerk wrote, "My father was stopped at the Capitol too, but he never said anything. Today I watched someone say it for him without speaking." Within hours, the clip had traveled into places that didn't usually host conversations about hearings or injustice. It was showing up in Zoom classrooms, church newsletters, law firm group chats. It wasn't labeled as entertainment. It wasn't packaged as outrage. It didn't need commentary to explain what had just happened. Everyone already knew. It wasn't the drama. It wasn't the political clash. It was that one still image. A man in a worn military coat, weathered face calm, eyes fixed on a woman who had just reduced his daughter's worth to a punchline. A social studies teacher in Kansas City projected the clip onto the wall of her 10th grade classroom. Her students, normally half distracted, didn't look away. When the clip ended, no one reached for their phones. One student, a quiet boy in the back with a hoodie pulled low over his eyes, whispered, "He didn't even have to say anything, and you could feel it." Later that afternoon, the teacher tweeted, "First time all year my class sat through a clip in total silence. They didn't have questions. They understood." The tweet went viral. Not because it was shocking, but because it was too familiar to ignore. And still, the video spread. But not like wildfire. Like truth, smoldering, persistent, undeniable. One post from a retired Army medic read, "I stood too fast and started crying. Didn't know I needed that." A young college student from Detroit wrote, "My dad stood the same way when our landlord lost our lease. I'd forgotten what it looked like until now." A pastor in Alabama posted, "He stood for every man who buried his dignity so his kids could rise." And over again, different words, same idea. He stood, and something inside me stood too. What stunned people most wasn't the volume of the moment, it was its restraint. There was no rage in that video, no retaliation, just clarity. A father standing, not to accuse, not to humiliate, but to bear witness. And somehow, that was what cut the deepest. It wasn't that Karoline had been defeated, it was that her certainty had been hollowed out by the sheer, unspoken weight of what she had tried to dismiss. People weren't cheering because Jasmine had landed a comeback. They were reflecting because they had just seen someone absorb decades of insult and choose to say nothing, because he didn't have to. For many who watched, it wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror. Not everyone saw themselves in it, but everyone saw something they hadn't been willing to name. The cost of silence, the power of presence, the loneliness of dignity in rooms that reward cruelty. And in thousands of comments, from veterans, teachers, single mothers, retired judges, and students alike, the same quiet theme repeated. That clip wasn't about who won, it was about who carried the weight. And they all knew who that was. It was the man who stood, without applause, and the world that could no longer pretend they didn't see him. The clip had ended, the studio lights had dimmed, and no one shouted her name. But Karoline still heard it echo every time she tried to speak. Karoline Leavitt wasn't destroyed. No headlines called for her resignation. No angry op-eds flooded the airwaves. She didn't become a trending cautionary tale or the center of a cancellation storm, but something quieter, and perhaps more permanent, unfolded in the days that followed. She canceled her schedule, not under pressure, by choice. The town halls, the live panels, the network hits that had once been lifeblood to her career suddenly felt like terrain she no longer recognized. She didn't disappear, she just stopped moving. As if she had been walking on firm ground and suddenly realized it had all been ice. And when it cracked, it hadn't sent her plunging. It had just left her standing there, unable to take another step. The silence was not punishment, it was reflection enforced by truth. Her team scrambled. Communication staff offered a dozen strategies: pause briefly and pivot, release a carefully worded statement, deflect, redirect, rebuild. One suggested she go on the offensive, call the whole thing overblown, part of another narrative war. But Karoline shook her head. She said no, not yet. Not like that. It wasn't guilt that kept her quiet. It was a different weight, something unfamiliar, something heavier than public backlash. The moment when your own words turn around and stare back at you, and you have to decide whether to look away. For 5 full days, her calendar stayed blank. She didn't tweet, didn't answer calls, didn't take interviews. She sat in her townhouse, blinds half drawn, replaying the footage. Not the whole hearing, just the moment. That moment. 38 seconds. His silence, his presence, her voice just before it, her own laughter. She listened to it not as a politician, not as a debater, but as a human being who had just, for the first time, spoken a sentence into a room and heard it fall apart in real time. The voices she usually relied on, her advisors, her consultants, even the mentors she'd long held as sacred, sounded distant now. They offered advice wrapped in procedure, but none of them had been in that studio. None of them had stood across from a father who had carried men through war zones and still had to watch his daughter be asked to carry dignity alone. And so, on the 6th day, Karoline made a choice no one predicted. She reached out to a small, independent podcast. No cameras, no studio audience. Just a quiet mic in a dim recording space hosted by journalist Lena Durham, known more for her integrity than her viewership numbers. Lena didn't tease the episode, no dramatic promos. Just a line on social: tomorrow's guest, someone ready to stop spinning and start listening. When the episode dropped, it wasn't an apology tour. Karoline didn't arrive with talking points. Her voice from the first second sounded smaller, not weak, but exposed, like someone who'd finally learned how little protection credentials can offer when truth enters the room. "I've been asked to say a lot of things this week," she began, "and I've written all of them down, but none of them felt right, because the only thing that felt real was the part I wasn't ready to say until now." She paused. Then, I wish I had known that I wasn't just talking to Jasmine Crockett. I was speaking into a room where a man who had once carried an entire battalion on his back was watching me reduce his daughter to a punchline. There was no music under her voice, no edits, just breathe, words, silence. That's what I didn't understand, she continued. I wasn't just wrong, I was reckless, and I didn't even know it. I thought I was being sharp, but I wasn't cutting through an argument. I was cutting through a memory I didn't own, a pain I've never lived, a silence I didn't even notice I was interrupting. She spoke in long pauses, not for effect, but because she had to fight for every word. I watched that clip later. Everyone's talking about when he stood. But what stays with me is when he sat back down. That moment wrecked me, because he didn't need to say anything. His silence was louder than anything I've said in the past 10 years. The host let her speak. No interruptions, no redirect. Karoline kept going. I've always prided myself on staying composed, but when he looked at me, without judgment, without emotion, just looked, it felt like he was asking a question I didn't know how to answer. And I think the question was, do you even understand what you're saying? She cleared her throat but didn't hide the emotion in it. I didn't, she said, and now I do. Not fully, not completely. I don't think I ever will. But I know enough now to understand that I have spoken too many times without asking who might be sitting in the third row. Lena finally spoke. What do you want people to take away from this? Karoline exhaled. Not that I'm sorry. That's too easy. I don't want this to be about me looking regretful. I want people to understand what happens when you walk into a room thinking you're the smartest voice in it and then realize, too late, that someone in that room has carried more silence than you've ever carried certainty. There was a pause, a long one. She closed with this. Some lessons don't come with applause. Some come with the sound of someone choosing not to respond to you because you haven't earned the right to be answered. And that was it. No follow-up statements, no press release. The podcast ended with a fade to silence. Not a brand reset, not a reputation rescue, just a woman sitting with what she said, and the man who made sure she would never say it that way again. And while Karoline's voice drifted into the quiet corners of a podcast, Jasmine spoke just once, without saying a word. The photo appeared without fanfare. No announcement, no teaser, no statement. Just an image, square-framed, posted from Jasmine Crockett's official account at 6:12 a.m., before most of Washington had even checked the headlines. It wasn't a selfie. It wasn't a call to action. It was her father, Lieutenant Colonel Isaiah Crockett, standing alone beneath an American flag, its cloth pulled taut by the morning wind, its shadow slicing down the wall behind him like a second spine. He wasn't saluting. He wasn't facing the camera. His back was straight, his hands behind him, his gaze fixed upward at the flag he had once defended in silence. No uniform, no medals. Just a quiet gray suit and a posture the country could no longer pretend to ignore. The caption was only 12 words long, but it detonated across the internet like a truth too long unspoken. He didn't need to speak, because he already sacrificed so others could. No hashtags, no emojis, no links. Just that. The image spread instantly, but not the way political posts usually do. It didn't provoke outrage. It didn't trigger arguments. It stopped people. It made them freeze mid-scroll, mid-sentence, mid-breath. It was the kind of image that didn't ask for interpretation. It commanded stillness. You didn't just view it. You stood in front of it, as if the silence of the man in the frame extended through the screen and held you where you were. The background was nothing more than a sunlit wall and the lower edge of a government building's western wing. But in that image, it looked like the edge of a country's conscience. The angle was low, deliberate maybe. It made the flag loom larger and made the man beneath it seem not small, but steadfast. He wasn't dwarfed by the flag. He was anchoring it, as if to remind everyone that its fabric meant nothing without the weight of those who had been asked to carry it without question and without thanks. Within an hour, the image had been reposted over 100,000 times. Veterans reposted it without commentary, just saluting emojis or the simple line, "We know." Civil rights attorneys reposted it with one-word captions: respect, silence, truth. School teachers printed it out and taped it beside chalkboards. One community college in Baltimore projected it on a hallway screen beneath a quote by James Baldwin. To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. But there was no rage in this image, only endurance. One high school teacher in South Carolina posted it during her third period U.S. history class. Her students watched in silence. No lecture, no explanation. One student raised his hand and asked, "Did he say anything after she insulted him?" The teacher shook her head. "No," she said. "He stood. That was enough." The class didn't move for a full minute. It was the first time they didn't ask for extra credit. They asked for a copy of the photo. The captions stayed pinned at the top of Jasmine's account for 3 days. No follow-up, no clarification. And that made it stronger. Because the silence around the image wasn't absence, it was architecture. It was what allowed the truth to expand inside people's chests, uncomfortable but necessary, like a memory suddenly returned to its rightful place. People weren't praising Jasmine for her words. They were thanking her for stepping aside and letting his story breathe. Reporters reached out. Editorial boards scrambled to write think pieces. Cable networks ran the image with scrolling captions. Silence that shook Washington. But every attempt to spin the moment, every interview request, every offer to go deeper, felt hollow. Because the image already said everything. He had stood without rage. He had looked without accusation. He had sat down not to retreat, but to finish a sentence that didn't need punctuation. And now, under the shadow of the flag he had once sworn to defend, the country had finally seen him. Not as a token, not as a backdrop, but as a witness. The man who had once walked through war zones returned home to be questioned at his daughter's hearing, and chose not to speak, because he knew the truth only lands when the world is forced to fall quiet. And Jasmine, knowing that, stepped aside and let that silence become a headline. The image of her father beneath the flag lingered in silence, but the world had already begun responding, not with noise, but with invitation. They didn't come for a soundbite. They didn't come for debate. One by one, universities across the country reached out to Jasmine, not to provoke, not to perform, but to understand. What they had witnessed inside that courtroom-turned-studio wasn't just restraint, it was control under fire. And students, many of them exhausted by rhetoric and spectacle, recognized something ancient in her silence. Discipline that didn't demand attention, but refused to disappear. The first event wasn't even publicized. It took place in the basement lecture hall of a Jesuit college in Maryland. 60 seats, everyone filled. The flyer didn't say Representative Jasmine Crockett. It read simply, "Holding the line, a conversation on presence." No live stream, no media credentials, just a single standing mic in the center aisle. Jasmine walked in alone. No entourage, no staffer, whispering updates. She wore a gray coat, a plain notebook tucked under one arm. And when she took the mic, she looked not at the back of the room, but directly at the students in the first row. The ones who had been told their silence wasn't strategy, only weakness. She didn't open with a defense. She opened with a memory. "I was taught that the loudest person in the room usually knows the least about what it costs to listen," she said. "So when I sat there, and I heard her words, and I felt the weight of the room shift, I didn't think about my platform. I thought about my father. I thought about how many rooms he had sat in, silent, while someone said something they knew he couldn't answer without being called angry." The students didn't clap. They just listened, still, eyes fixed, because they hadn't come for applause. They came to learn how to carry silence and not collapse under it. At Columbia, the room was larger, but no less quiet. A law professor introduced Jasmine by saying, "We invite speakers here to teach constitutional strategy, but tonight we're here to study emotional intelligence under duress." She took the podium without slides, no charts, no prepared speech. She placed a single image on the screen behind her, her father standing beneath the flag, just like in her post. The room held its breath. For a full 10 seconds, she didn't say a word. Then slowly, "This is what courage looks like when it's tired of proving itself." She didn't name Karoline once. She didn't need to. That part of the memory was already fading for most people anyway. Ask 1,000 students what Karoline had said, and 90% couldn't tell you. But ask them what they remember about the moment, and they would say this: the way the air in the room froze when her father stood up. The way he didn't flinch, didn't smirk, didn't even move his hands. Just rose, as if history had stood with him. At one university in Minnesota, a student asked her, "How did you not respond? How did you stay still?" Jasmine paused, then answered, "Because there's a difference between silence that protects power and silence that exposes it. Mine wasn't retreat, it was clarity. I didn't need to swing. My father was already standing. And sometimes that's the loudest thing you can do." The audience didn't cheer. They didn't need to. What Jasmine brought into those rooms wasn't energy, it was weight, the weight of memory, of every time someone like her had to smile through insult, the weight of knowing that justice often demands not more rage, but more patience than most people realize is survivable. Students began to share the experience online, but not with viral quotes or flashy edits. They shared screenshots of the flag, of her father's stillness, of Jasmine standing behind a lectern in front of empty chalkboards, saying more in the pauses than most politicians say in a campaign cycle. One post read, "She didn't give us a master class in debating. She gave us a master class in surviving it." In one auditorium in Chicago, an African-American freshman stood during the Q&A, tears in his eyes. He didn't ask a question. He just said, "My dad doesn't talk about what he went through. But when your father stood up that day, I finally understood what he's been carrying." Jasmine didn't cry. She nodded, not for show, but as one witness to another. That's what the nation had begun to understand. It was no longer about Karoline. Her words, rehearsed and televised, had scattered like leaves in a storm. No one was quoting the jab anymore. No one cared whether it had been intended as sarcasm or offense, because history doesn't remember punchlines. It remembers who stood. It remembers how. What lasted, what students, professors, and even former skeptics couldn't forget, was the man who rose without anger, and the daughter who let the room sit with his silence until it couldn't bear to look away. In that stillness, generations of injustice had made themselves visible, without shouting, without retaliation, just presence. And Jasmine had carried it, not by shouting over someone else, but by refusing to let the moment pass unmarked. Not one campus invited her to teach them how to win arguments. They invited her to teach them how to withstand them. And across every stage, in every room filled with future judges, senators, and school teachers, Jasmine taught only one thing: that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do in the face of insult is to let silence speak for those who were never given the mic. And that kind of silence, it never fades. And as the students left in silence, carrying fragments of a presence they couldn't explain, one truth remained. This was never just a political moment. It was a human one. The lesson didn't come wrapped in applause. It didn't arrive at the end of a passionate speech or a moment of triumph. It came in the quiet, in the seconds after Jasmine stepped off the stage, in the breath she took before she spoke, in the photo of her father standing beneath a flag he had once defended and been denied by. The lesson was not about politics, it was about memory, about the weight we carry when the world insists we have nothing to prove, yet still demands that we justify our existence every time we enter the room. It was about how easily a lifetime of sacrifice can be erased with a joke, and how sometimes the most powerful resistance is to refuse to answer insult with noise. Jasmine never called for pity. She didn't list the wrongs. She simply let them exist in the space, unedited and intact. Her father being denied a home after war, being asked for ID at the Capitol he bled to protect, being told again and again that his silence was safer than his truth. And still he stood, not to interrupt, not to scold, but to remind the room and the nation that dignity doesn't beg to be seen. It shows up, stands tall, and waits for someone to finally notice. That was the lesson, not the pain itself, but how it was carried, without spectacle, without retaliation, without surrender. The injustice was sharp and present. It wasn't buried in history. It sat in the audience in a faded military coat. It lived in the way Jasmine's voice stayed level while her skin was politicized. It breathed in the pause between Karoline's joke and Jasmine's silence. And the lesson it taught was cruelly simple. Those who endure the most are often asked to prove it the least convincingly. But Jasmine didn't teach them to be angry. She taught them to hold, to wait, to let the silence wrap around the moment like a fuse. Because sometimes you don't need to explode. You need to make the room sit in what it just heard. And that restraint, that impossible, deliberate restraint, is where justice starts. People had expected her to strike back, to bury Karoline with brilliance, to win the moment with fire. But she didn't want to win. She wanted people to remember, not her words, but his presence. Because in the end, that's what outlasted the noise. People forgot what was said, but they never forgot who stood. And that is the brutal, human lesson no one could deny. In a world obsessed with speaking, Jasmine showed what it means to choose silence, not out of fear, but out of purpose. Out of generational knowledge that sometimes your very existence is loud enough. Out of a lifetime of watching people who look like her father be denied everything, yet still salute the flag that forgot them. What did we learn? That grace under fire is not weakness. It is strategy. That silence is not surrender. It is calculation. That the people with the most to say are often the ones who sit back and watch what the room does without their help. And maybe the most sobering lesson of all, when someone says, "It's just a joke," ask yourself, who had to survive that joke for 50 years straight just to sit in that chair? That's the man Jasmine was raised by. And that's the lesson she taught a nation that only listens once it's forced to. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a federal courtroom built to crush dissent, Clarence Thomas unleashes a legal ambush on AOC, accusing her of campaign fraud in a trial rigged from the start. But just as the gavel drops and the media declares her finished, Jasmine Crockett storms into the room with one explosive revelation: proof the evidence was forged, and the judge himself orchestrated the deception. Within hours, the courtroom erupts, the Supreme Court spirals into crisis, and Thomas faces a public outcry that could end his career in disgrace. As the nation watches a justice become the accused, one chilling question cuts through the chaos. Just how high does this rot climb, and who will be the next titan to fall when the truth detonates? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The news broke like a thunderclap across the Capitol. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has been summoned to testify before a federal tribunal in Washington, D.C. The charge: alleged abuse of campaign funds, an accusation vague in detail but explosive in implication. What stunned even seasoned legal analysts wasn't the charge. It was who authorized the hearing. None other than Justice Clarence Thomas, bypassing all traditional procedural filters to fast-track the hearing under an obscure constitutional clause unused in decades. Within hours, headlines erupted across right-wing media outlets. AOC on trial, the collapse of the progressive idol. Clarence Thomas slams the gavel on woke hypocrisy. The tone was not judicial, it was vengeful. The official summons gave Ocasio-Cortez just 48 hours to prepare. No prior complaints, no official audit, just an emergency session. Signed at midnight. She didn't even have time to return to New York before being ordered into courtroom 3A, the same courtroom used for high-profile corruption trials during wartime. Something was off. This wasn't justice. This was theater, with only one purpose: public execution by legal means. When AOC arrived at the courthouse, the air was thick with humidity and tension. Reporters swarmed the marble steps like wasps. Helicopters hovered above. Cameras zoomed in on her every blink. Dressed in a navy blue blazer and white blouse, her jaw clenched, she walked past the noise with a silence louder than any statement she could give. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Senators, federal attorneys, and a surprising number of corporate observers took their seats like they were watching a premiere. At the center, elevated above the rest, sat Clarence Thomas, expressionless, but radiating control like a man who already knew how the story ended. The flag stood still. The tension didn't. There was no jury, no panel, just a single chair prepared at the witness stand, under glaring lights that didn't flicker. And as AOC took her seat, all of America watched, but only a few realized what was really happening. A trial meant not to uncover the truth, but to bury it alive. And just when the air in the chamber seemed too heavy to breathe, when silence gripped even the reporters trained to stay detached, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was instructed, without warning, to take the stand. She moved calmly, but her eyes betrayed the storm behind them. She had come with her own attorney, a respected constitutional litigator known for dismantling partisan subpoenas. But none of that seemed to matter now. The room had already been set against her. There was no defense table, no opposing counsel listed on the official docket. Just her, the chair, and a row of screens waiting to light up like the walls of an interrogation chamber. What was supposed to be a bipartisan hearing had, without explanation, been restructured into a one-sided review, a format that gave Clarence Thomas the authority to question directly, challenge freely, and rule unilaterally. It was legal in structure, but not in spirit. As she adjusted the microphone in front of her, Thomas leaned forward, not with the measured detachment of a judge, but with the cold familiarity of someone who had waited for this exact moment. "Congresswoman," he began in a voice so measured it felt mechanical, "some might say you've built a career on optics, but how do you reconcile a beautiful image with dirty hands?" The question sliced through the chamber like a scalpel. Audible gasps echoed across the rows. Her attorney shot to his feet, voice controlled but firm. "Objection, irrelevant and overtly personal." Thomas didn't flinch. He didn't look up. "Objection is noted and overruled," he said flatly. And just like that, the first cut had landed, and no one stepped in to stop the bleeding. The screens came alive next, filling with digital documents, campaign finance logs, wire transfers, email headers with blurry timestamps. Exhibit A, B, C, each more ominous than the last. Thomas read aloud selectively, highlighting entries from political action committees no one had ever heard of, with acronyms designed to obscure their true origins. "Congresswoman, are you familiar with the Civic Horizons Initiative?" he asked. AOC opened her mouth to answer, but Thomas didn't wait. "Because they've donated $37,400 to your 2022 re-election fund through a shell account routed from an organization based in Nassau. Do you deny that?" Her lawyer interrupted. "We request clarification on the source. These documents haven't been authenticated." Again, Thomas barely reacted. "The source is the public record," he said, eyes still fixed on the printed sheets. "Or are you suggesting Congress has something to hide?" There was no due process, only accusations dressed as questions and evidence curated to humiliate. The documents hadn't been verified through any independent auditor. They were part of a leak circulated to select media outlets 2 days earlier. Leaks that had curiously appeared just hours after the hearing was announced, and yet they were now being treated as gospel. AOC sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her voice stolen not by fear, but by the realization that this wasn't a hearing. This was an ambush, and the courtroom had become a stage for character assassination. Every protest her attorney raised was ignored. Every effort to clarify was shut down. Thomas controlled the tempo like a maestro, and the music was designed to drown her. What made it worse, what made it feel like betrayal on a national scale, was not just the manipulation of evidence, but the posture of legitimacy wrapped around it. The flags behind Thomas, the seal on the wall, the CSPAN cameras capturing every angle. It was theater masquerading as truth, and everyone watching from home had no idea the script was already written. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about guilt. It was about breaking a woman in full view of the country and making sure she had no voice left to explain why. But the courtroom assault didn't end when the microphones were cut. It only changed platforms. The moment AOC stepped out of that building, the headlines hit like coordinated missile fire. News sites lit up with thumbnails of her sitting under cold fluorescent lights. frozen in silence, her hands clasped like someone bracing for impact. AOC caught flat-footed in campaign finance clash. Thomas schools Ocasio-Cortez in live ethics showdown. On TV, they played the same 30-second clip, her pausing before answering a question, blinking under the pressure, as if that hesitation was enough to label her guilty. The footage didn't show the objections that were shut down. It didn't show the altered documents. It didn't show the fear on her attorney's face, or the way Clarence Thomas cut off every response mid-sentence. It was selective memory at scale. And worst of all, even outlets that once stood with her, those who championed progressive voices, were suddenly waiting for more information. In the media war, neutrality became complicity, and AOC was now fighting alone against a narrative that moved faster than the facts. Later that evening, her hotel room was dim, save for the soft glow of a laptop screen and the city lights bleeding through the curtains. She sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, still in her courtroom clothes, creased blazer, heels discarded near the coffee table, hair let down but unbrushed. Her phone buzzed nonstop with missed calls and unread messages, but she ignored them all. What she needed wasn't spin. It wasn't damage control. It was to be heard unfiltered. She opened her laptop, logged into her social accounts, and hit Go Live. No script, no handler, just her voice, raw and worn, yet unmistakably steady. "They didn't give me space to explain today," she began, eyes locked on the camera. "So I'll make space now." There was no anger in her tone, only exhaustion and something more dangerous. Clarity. "I am not afraid of being questioned. I welcome it. But today I wasn't questioned. I was cornered." She paused, inhaled, and delivered the truth like a closing argument to the nation. "I'm not afraid of being judged. I'm afraid the system has stopped caring about being fair." For a moment, the feed was quiet. Then the comments flooded in. Not bots, not hashtags. People. Real people. Waking up. But outside that room, in studios and strategy rooms, the narrative machine roared on. And AOC knew this wasn't the climax. It was only the first shot. And while the courtroom was still echoing with the sound of silence left behind by AOC's livestream, somewhere nearly 1,300 miles away, Jasmine Crockett was watching, alone and fully awake. Sitting in a modest office suite in downtown Dallas, her heels off, a cold cup of coffee untouched on the table, she stared at the grainy live stream playing across her laptop. The signal lagged slightly, but not enough to miss the moment that made her sit up. A document flashed across the courtroom screens. Exhibit E, Thomas called it. Jasmine leaned in. Her eyes locked on the formatting. Her brain caught the margins, the font spacing, the watermark style. It wasn't unfamiliar. In fact, it was hauntingly familiar. She had seen it before. 2 years ago, buried inside a case she had personally helped dismiss. A campaign finance dispute in Georgia involving a forged PAC donation trail. The file used today against AOC had the same structure, the same missing data rows, even the same spreadsheet tab name. But this wasn't deja vu. It was digital fraud, and someone had recycled it. The worst part wasn't that the document was fake. The worst part was that Clarence Thomas had presented it as legitimate federal evidence on live television to destroy a sitting congresswoman. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She pulled open her drawer, retrieved an encrypted drive, and inserted it into her laptop. Within seconds, she had the original file open, time-stamped, logged, and authenticated by a forensics analyst 2 years ago. The match was exact, except for one row added and one name replaced. The room felt colder now, not because of fear, but because she understood what this meant. If this could happen to AOC live at the federal level, then the judiciary was no longer broken. It was weaponized. She didn't wait for permission. She gave orders. "We're going to D.C. now," she said to her advisor, already dialing. "I want our legal team in the air within the hour. We bring everything." Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. There was steel in her tone, and a kind of quiet fury that only surfaced when the law itself had been betrayed. As her staff scrambled, Jasmine packed her bag with precision. The drive, a legal binder, and one navy blazer. She didn't bother with makeup or sound bites. This wasn't a press play. This was war. 35 minutes later, she was in the back of a black SUV on the way to Lovefield, her phone buzzing with texts from colleagues watching the same live stream with growing dread. "It's worse than we thought," one message read. Jasmine didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the window, city lights blurring past. Her mind replayed Thomas's voice, calling AOC a pretty face with dirty ethics. It wasn't just cruel, it was deliberate, targeted, strategic, and it violated everything Jasmine had spent her career defending. As the plane lifted off into the night, heading toward a city caught in a storm of silence and power, Jasmine opened her laptop one more time. She clicked play on the archived courtroom stream, paused it at the exact frame of the fake document, and whispered, not for effect, but because it was all she needed to remind herself why she was going. This isn't politics anymore. This is a lie with paperwork. And she was done letting lies win. And just as the third hour of the hearing ticked past, after 3 days of unanswered accusations, suppressed objections, and a growing sense that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been left to face a firing squad disguised as a legal proceeding, the room changed. The rear doors of courtroom 3A creaked open, not loudly, but sharply enough to break the illusion of order. Heads turned. Cameras shifted. Jasmine Crockett entered with the quiet intensity of someone who didn't come to ask questions. She came for answers. Dressed in a tailored black suit, her posture straight and unflinching, she didn't glance at the press row or the gallery. She didn't pause to acknowledge the murmurs spreading like wildfire through the room. Her eyes locked directly on the bench, and without breaking stride, she made her way to the well of the chamber. She stopped in front of the clerk's table, her voice clear and firm, not loud, but undeniably present. "Madam Clerk, I'm Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas. I'm here to serve as special legal counsel to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez." The room stilled. Even the stenographer's keys went silent. Clarence Thomas, sitting at the elevated bench, leaned forward slowly, eyes narrowing. "That request is denied," he said sharply. "You are not credentialed in this proceeding. You hold no recognized status here." His words echoed, but Jasmine didn't flinch. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she replied, holding up a printed statute. "Under Federal Procedural Provision 18-4B, emergency counsel can be appointed mid-session if the defendant affirms the appointment and if procedural fairness is in question." Her tone never rose. It didn't need to. The truth was heavier than volume. Thomas leaned back, exhaling slowly. The power in the room shifted by inches. Then he looked directly at AOC. "Is this your counsel?" he asked, his voice tinged with reluctance. AOC, still seated under the punishing lights, looked up at Jasmine, her first real ally in days, and nodded. Not with desperation, with conviction. "Yes," she said clearly, "I authorize her representation." That moment, just a nod and a sentence, felt like a rupture in a dam. The clerk double-checked the statute. The legality was real, the precedent was rare, and the permission, now granted, changed everything. Jasmine Crockett didn't smile. She didn't look triumphant. She simply opened the folder in her hand, placed it gently on the table, and said the words no one expected to hear in that room that day. "Then let's talk about the truth." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was tense, electric. The kind of silence that comes right before everything turns. The silence that followed Jasmine's recognition as legal counsel was brief, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that comes right before something shifts beneath your feet. She stepped forward, eyes fixed on the bench. Her posture steady but electric with purpose. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear, "before this hearing proceeds, I move to challenge the integrity of one of the key exhibits presented against my client, specifically Exhibit E, the financial document allegedly showing illicit PAC contributions to Representative Ocasio-Cortez." She turned to the monitor behind her, holding up a printed copy of the document. "This file was submitted the morning this hearing began, stamped, logged, and used as primary evidence to justify the accusations before this chamber. But what this court hasn't been shown is where it came from, or what it used to look like." She clicked a remote in her hand. A second version of the same document appeared on the courtroom screen, side by side with the one used by Clarence Thomas. The room tensed as the similarities became clear. Same columns, same formatting, same amounts. This, Jasmine said, pointing to the screen, is the original source file. It was part of a legal investigation from 2 years ago in Georgia. The structure is identical, except for a few convenient edits. She zoomed in on the signature line of the new exhibit. This version is signed by a man named Robert M. Decker. But there's a problem, Your Honor. She paused, not for effect, but to let the weight of what she was about to say land clean. Mr. Decker has been deceased for over a year and a half. His name and digital signature were pulled from a prior public filing, then inserted into this document to give it a false appearance of legality. A ripple of disbelief moved through the room. AOC's jaw tensed. Reporters blinked at their screens, already drafting headlines in their heads. Jasmine didn't flinch. She continued, her tone sharpening. This isn't an oversight. It's not a clerical mistake. It's fabrication, presented under the authority of this court, and it was used to build a public narrative against my client before she was ever allowed to speak. She stepped closer to the bench, lowering the tone of her voice just enough to make every word sting. I ask this court, and the American people watching, to consider the implications. If we allow documents like this, documents that are doctored, manipulated, and resurrected from past cases, to be passed off as truth, then this isn't justice, it's performance, and we are all complicit. There was no applause, no gasps, just a long, stunned stillness, like the air itself was deciding whether it could bear the truth Jasmine Crockett had just put on record. And for the first time since the trial began, the pressure in the room shifted, not toward the defendant, but back toward the bench. The room was holding its breath. The accusation had been made, the forged signature exposed, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. Now it was time to prove it. Jasmine Crockett turned toward the clerk's desk, nodded once, and motioned to the back of the courtroom. A man rose quietly from the gallery, dressed not in a flashy suit or political uniform, but in the calm, muted tones of someone who preferred data to drama. His name was Dr. Miles Kessler, a veteran forensic analyst who had served as a consultant on more than a dozen federal fraud cases. He didn't smile as he walked forward. He didn't nod to the cameras. He simply approached the stand like a surgeon approaching an operating table, focused, precise, and ready to dissect the lie. After being sworn in, Kessler placed a thin stack of documents on the witness desk and opened to the first page. Your Honor, he began, speaking with the quiet authority of someone who knew his words would carry weight, I was asked to perform a forensic analysis on the metadata of Exhibit E, the campaign finance record used to support the charges against Representative Ocasio-Cortez. He clicked a button on the monitor beside him. Two versions of the same file appeared side by side on the screen. What you see here, he said, pointing, is the file submitted to this court. And here, this is the same file's metadata log, retrieved from its edit history. What's concerning is not just what's in the document, but how it got there. He highlighted a section in red. This file was modified 4 separate times in under 2 hours. Each edit came from a different user ID, none of which are registered to the federal campaign oversight system. The gallery stirred. Thomas remained still. The final version, the one you received, was saved just 23 minutes before it was submitted into evidence. That's unusual on its own. But what's more troubling is that the metadata shows 2 overwrites, one to scrub the previous timestamps and another to embed a false author ID. In layman's term, he continued, glancing at the senators in the room, this document was cleaned, altered, and disguised by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He paused briefly, then added, there's more. The signature included on the document, Robert M. Decker, was digitally inserted. Mr. Decker passed away 18 months ago. His name was pulled from an unrelated filing and overlaid to give this document false legitimacy. This wasn't a typo. It wasn't an error. It was deliberate fabrication. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of news crews, realizing what they had just heard. AOC blinked hard, jaw clenched, staring down at her folded hands. Jasmine Crockett kept her eyes on the bench, and Clarence Thomas, once so commanding, sat like a statue. The truth hadn't just entered the room. It had been sworn in, cross-referenced, and laid bare for the world to see. Even after exposing the doctored evidence, Jasmine Crockett stood before the court with the unmistakable composure of someone who had one final card to play and knew it would shake the walls. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She simply took a measured breath, as if to remind herself that this wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal. Personal to AOC. Personal to every public servant who'd ever had the truth twisted against them in plain sight. "Before we move on, Your Honor," she said, her tone steady, almost clinical, "there's one more item the defense wishes to submit for review, marked Exhibit H." Her hand slipped inside the folder once more, this time retrieving a small black envelope, which she held with visible care. "Contained within is a digital audio file," she continued. "It was provided under confidential protection by a federal employee, a clerk, someone who works within these very chambers." She paused and let that last sentence settle. A few murmurs stirred in the gallery. This person came forward voluntarily, under penalty of perjury, and stated that they were pressured directly to alter metadata on the campaign finance exhibit previously discussed. The courtroom hushed again, but this time the silence felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Jasmine handed the envelope to the court clerk, who inserted the drive into the system console. Her voice dropped to a register just above a whisper, though every word was crystal clear. "The defense requests permission to play this recording for the court and to have it entered into the record." Clarence Thomas didn't answer right away. He glanced to the side as if weighing 1,000 variables behind his unmoving expression. Then, with the faintest flick of his wrist, he nodded to the technician. Permission granted. The lights dimmed slightly as the courtroom monitors came to life. For a few seconds, all that could be heard was a faint hiss of white noise, room tone, background hum. Then a voice emerged. Male, deep, deliberate, not rushed, not angry, but chillingly casual in its confidence, like a man too powerful to worry about being overheard. "As long as it's enough to bury AOC, who the hell cares if it's real or not?" The words fell like a hammer through the room. A long, excruciating silence followed. Not the kind that came from confusion. The kind that came when every person in the room understood exactly what they'd just heard, but couldn't quite believe they'd heard it. No one moved. The air in courtroom 3A was suddenly too heavy to breathe. Reporters sat frozen, their hands hovering above keyboards. A junior aide in the gallery pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. The technician at the soundboard turned pale. Even the clerk's eyes flickered upward toward the bench, because this wasn't a headline anymore. This was a voice, a sentence, a confession, not shouted in anger or muttered in fear, but spoken with the lazy certainty of someone convinced they were untouchable. Jasmine didn't speak yet. She waited. Let the silence work. Let the court, let the nation feel the weight of what it means to hear corruption spoken out loud, not by a political operative, but by a man wearing the robe of ultimate judicial authority. Then the screen behind her shifted. A new overlay appeared, a waveform graph, accompanied by a digital authentication report. At the bottom of the screen, in unmistakable white text on a black background, it read, "Voice print, match 94.7%. Clarence Thomas." Beneath that, source, Federal Bureau of Acoustic Forensics, Office of Legal Evidence Integrity. Now Jasmine turned toward the judge, not toward the bench of Thomas, but toward the presiding chair, the one technically responsible for admitting evidence. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "what we've just heard is not speculation. It's not out of context. It's not interpretation. It is, by all forensic standards, authentic. This voice belongs to Justice Clarence Thomas. And the content of that recording is not legal analysis. It's not a procedural comment. It's a statement of intent, a statement of motive, and a statement of disregard for due process and the truth itself." Her voice didn't tremble. It was almost too calm, like someone refusing to let the truth be diluted by anger. "This isn't about a procedural flaw," she added, each word deliberate. "It's about trust, about whether the highest court in this country can be allowed to weaponize its authority to destroy reputations with manufactured evidence." She paused again, then took a slow step back from the podium, letting the screen remain in full view. The American people are listening, and they deserve to know who's speaking. Across the room, AOC sat perfectly still. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She had endured everything: accusation, humiliation, character assassination. But now finally the tide had turned. Not through rhetoric, not through outrage, but through something far more dangerous to the powerful: receipts. And Clarence Thomas, so often the one asking the questions, had just become the answer. And as the final waveform faded from the courtroom monitors, as Jasmine Crockett stepped back from the bench and silence reclaimed the air like a returning tide, the weight of what had just been heard didn't stop inside the chamber. It detonated far beyond it. Within seconds, reporters leapt to their phones. A CNN producer whispered, "Clip that now," into her headset, while a New York Times journalist texted a single sentence to his editor. Thomas caught on tape, real voice, real words. But it wasn't just the press. It was everyone. Congressional staffers, lobbyists, law students live streaming the hearing during lectures. Thousands, then tens of thousands of Americans were watching on public feeds when the audio file was played. They heard the voice. They read the forensic match. They didn't wait for permission to react. The clip began spreading like wildfire, first in private group chats, then in Twitter threads, then cut into reels and TikToks with only 6 words in bold over black. "Who the hell cares if it's real?" A sentence that didn't just destroy credibility, it incinerated it. By the time Jasmine returned to her seat beside AOC, the internet had already shifted. On X, formerly Twitter, a hashtag began to climb with brutal speed. #Justice for AOC. It started as a whisper: students, young voters, campaign volunteers, who remembered why they'd voted for her in the first place. But the second wave came faster, louder, and angrier. Attorneys, civil rights leaders, and constitutional scholars who had spent years defending the sanctity of process, only to now witness that very process wielded as a weapon against a member of Congress. And then the next hashtag landed: heavier, meaner, unforgiving. Thomas treason. It surged like a riptide, retweeted by celebrities, journalists, sitting House members, even retired federal judges. The word treason wasn't used lightly. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a collective scream against a system that had just been caught with its hand, not only in the machinery, but on the trigger. Screens lit up in cafes and gyms, in subways and break rooms. On college campuses, students crowded around TVs in stunned disbelief as the voice replayed on loop. As long as it's enough to bury AOC, no edits, no music, just the raw, flat truth and the staggering silence afterward. Within 30 minutes, the video had reached over 12 million views. TikTok creators stitched the audio over images of AOC sitting under fluorescent lights. Journalists played it alongside quotes from Thomas's past rulings on ethics and judicial restraint. Legal scholars posted side-by-side transcripts of what he said in court versus what he said off mic, and the contrast was damning. On Reddit, a thread titled, "This isn't a trial, it's a setup," climbed to the top of /r/politics within 12 minutes, with over 14,000 upvotes and comments flooding in by the second. "I don't care what party you're in. This is a disgrace. This is why people don't trust the courts." Clarence Thomas just became the Watergate tape. But it wasn't just digital noise. It was coordinated outrage. Petitions were launched demanding an immediate ethics review. Law professors drafted open letters. Protesters began gathering outside federal courthouses from New York to Oakland, with signs that read, "We heard him too, and truth isn't treason, but this is." Inside the Capitol, aides scrambled to respond. AOC's team, caught between relief and emotional shock, had no comment. Jasmine Crockett declined all press for the moment, instead staying beside her client, not as a politician, but as a shield, the kind forged in quiet outrage and wielded with surgical focus. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply watched the monitors as the world began doing what the courtroom had not. Listen. Every network, MSNBC, ABC, even Fox, had cut into regular programming. They didn't just report the story, they played the clip in full. News anchors, visibly stunned, paused after the tape ended, grasping for words to make sense of what viewers had just witnessed. He said the quiet part out loud, one anchor said bluntly. This isn't partisan anymore, said another. This is structural. By nightfall, international press had joined. Le Monde referred to it as le scandale judiciaire du siècle. The BBC simply called it the tape. On Al Jazeera, political analysts debated whether this would mark a turning point in global trust in the U.S. judiciary. Even foreign diplomats, usually silent on internal matters, began tweeting cautiously worded statements about the need for judicial integrity in all democratic systems. Meanwhile, online, the hashtags refused to fade. Dar Justice for AOC became more than a slogan. It became a banner under which millions gathered. People began sharing their own stories of being disbelieved, silenced, undermined, of how it feels when truth is treated like an inconvenience. A single TikTok of a teenage girl holding a sign that read, "I'm not AOC, but I know that voice," was shared nearly 200,000 times within an hour. Underneath it, one comment stood out. She didn't break, she waited, and the truth came. But nothing captured the moment quite like the replays of AOC's face during the hearing. That moment, after the clip had played, after the waveform and authentication were shown, when she just sat there, still and silent, was captured in high-resolution stills that circulated like portraits of resistance. Her jaw clenched, her hands folded, her eyes rimmed with restrained fury, not because she was broken, but because after everything, the truth had finally spoken on her behalf. And it wasn't just the public watching now. Inside law firms, clerks pulled up procedural codes. Inside government agencies, emails were exchanged with subject lines like, urgent, clarification on judge audio admissibility. Senators, including some from Thomas's ideological circle, suddenly found themselves cornered by reporters asking for comment. A few released lukewarm statements about awaiting all the facts. Others vanished entirely from public view, hoping to ride out the firestorm. But the tide wasn't waiting, because this wasn't just about one moment of corruption. This was about the machinery behind it, about how someone so high, so protected, so cloaked in institutional armor could say something so reckless, so damning, and believe no one would ever hear it. But now the world had heard it, and the world doesn't unhear. Back inside courtroom 3A, as dusk began to press against the high windows, the courtroom remained seated, but the silence had transformed. It was no longer the silence of fear or domination. It was the silence that follows a tectonic shift, when everyone present realizes that something irreversible has just happened, but the next move hasn't yet been spoken. Jasmine Crockett sat beside AOC without saying a word. She didn't need to. Her job, at least for this moment, was done. She had carried the truth into a room that had long since closed its ears, and now the walls were bleeding with it. Outside, the protesters' chants began echoing through the stone corridors of the Capitol. We heard the voice. We demand a choice. Justice is not above the law. She stood alone. She's not alone now. And in every corner of the internet, on every screen, under every trending banner, one sentence kept repeating itself over and over again. As long as it's enough to bury AOC, followed by the same reply, written by thousands, whispered by millions. It wasn't. She's still standing. And as the sound of that sentence, as long as it's enough to bury AOC, continued to reverberate across the country like a national betrayal caught on tape, it didn't take long for pressure to build from within the Capitol itself. The shock had passed. What followed was rage, but not the performative kind. Not partisan shouting across cable news panels. This was something more rare. Righteous discomfort that crossed the aisle. It started behind closed doors in whispered conversations in elevators, overburned coffee in committee rooms. But within hours, those whispers hardened into emails, into statements, into formal calls for action. Senator Alan Whitford, a moderate Republican from Pennsylvania, known for rarely weighing in on judicial matters, was the first to break the line. His post hit X like a bolt of lightning. Any justice caught manipulating evidence or aiding its manipulation must immediately recuse, no matter their rank. This isn't about politics. This is about preserving the courtroom as sacred space. Within 30 minutes, his post had been shared over 90,000 times. But more importantly, it opened the floodgates. Soon came Senator Marcia Hill, a conservative from Utah who had clashed publicly with AOC in the past, stepping to the podium outside her office. I've disagreed with Representative Ocasio-Cortez on nearly everything, but I will not stand silent while a Supreme Court justice abuses the robe to silence political opponents. That's not justice. That's tyranny with a legal font. The line had been crossed, not between parties, but between those defending institutions and those dismantling them from within. Back inside the Capitol, a rare emergency meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee was convened. AOC was not present. Neither was Jasmine Crockett. They didn't need to be. The conversation wasn't about them anymore. It was about Clarence Thomas, and it was happening fast. C-SPAN cameras captured senators entering the chamber with grim expressions and muted tones. Microphones caught snippets. This isn't sustainable. If we don't say something now, when do we? If the integrity of the bench falls, what's left? Within that session, Senator Donnelly, a centrist Democrat from Michigan, circulated a letter titled Joint Resolution Requesting Immediate Recusal of Justice. Clarence Thomas from any further oversight involving Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The title was long. The message was not. It read, given the clear conflict of interest, combined with the authenticated audio evidence currently in public domain, we, the undersigned, formally urge Justice Clarence Thomas to recuse himself from all further proceedings related to this case. If he fails to do so voluntarily, we will seek legislative remedies to enforce such recusal through constitutional channels. By the end of the hour, 7 Republicans had signed it, along with 36 Democrats and 2 independents. That alone would have been unprecedented, but it didn't stop there, because by the time the cameras caught wind of the letter, it had already been delivered, not to the press, but to the chambers of the Supreme Court itself. Reporters rushed to confirm. Lines lit up at news desks from D.C. to New York. Is this real? Producers whispered. Did they really send it straight to the court? The answer came not from a leak, but from a live press conference outside the Capitol, where 4 senators, 2 from each party, stood shoulder to shoulder before a wall of microphones. The most unexpected voice was Senator Brandon Tate, a libertarian-leaning Republican from Arizona, known for his aggressive defense of judicial independence. But even he seemed shaken. He didn't read from a script. He didn't recite talking points. He looked directly into the camera and said, I've defended this court. I've defended Justice Thomas. I've defended the process. But today I can't defend the indefensible. That voice on the tape doesn't belong in a courtroom. It belongs in a courtroom as a defendant. Gasps rang out among the press. Even veteran correspondents blinked. This wasn't political theater. This was institutional revolt. And all the while, the American people weren't waiting for permission to judge. On X, Tishuri recused Thomas now started trending within 17 minutes of the letter's delivery. It was joined by posts from former federal prosecutors, retired judges, and even constitutional historians, many of whom had never before publicly questioned the legitimacy of a sitting Supreme Court justice. But the audio had made silence impossible. On college campuses, students gathered in lecture halls demanding that law schools issue statements. In major cities, digital billboards flashed the now infamous waveform graphic from the voice print match alongside the phrase, "This is not justice." Even the typically reserved American Bar Association issued a rare public advisory, stating, "No member of the judiciary, regardless of rank, may ethically preside over a matter in which they have demonstrated bias or prejudgment. We urge Justice Thomas to consider the precedent he is creating." Inside courtroom 3A, the tension grew minute by minute. AOC and Jasmine had not yet re-entered. The room was in a legal holding pattern, waiting for clarity that couldn't be ignored much longer. All eyes, quietly unspoken, were on the man in the robe at the bench. Clarence Thomas sat unmoved, his expression carved from stone, but his silence now said more than any ruling he could issue. He had not responded publicly, he had not addressed the voice, but he hadn't left either. He was still on that bench, still presiding over a case in which his impartiality was now less than dust. And the pressure only climbed. A group of House members led by Representative Elijah Rodriguez of Florida, a centrist Democrat with deep military credentials, called an emergency press briefing outside the Rayburn building. He held up the same letter from the Senate and added, "If this chamber does not act with urgency, then we are all complicit in allowing judicial corruption to stand unchecked. I don't care what robes you wear. If you manipulate justice to crush your enemies, you don't belong in a courtroom. You belong in history's darkest footnotes." Chants erupted from the crowd behind him. "Recuse now! Recuse now! The court is not a weapon. No judge is above the truth." It wasn't just performance. These weren't empty slogans. They were born of something Americans had not felt this deeply in years. Disgust not at partisan betrayal, but at the betrayal of the Constitution itself. Back on Capitol Hill, several lawmakers began referring to the situation not as an ethics issue, but as a national judicial emergency. Think tanks scrambled to assess the legal implications if a Supreme Court justice refused to step aside amid a verified conflict. Would a refusal trigger a broader investigation? Could it trigger impeachment? No one knew for certain, but one thing had become crystal clear. The court was now on trial, and the man presiding over that trial, Clarence Thomas, was no longer seen as the judge. He was the crisis. In state legislatures across the country, local representatives began proposing symbolic resolutions, urging judicial reform. Late-night news shows, once quick to divide every issue down party lines, found themselves unexpectedly unified. Even conservative legal analysts, who had long shielded Thomas from criticism, admitted on camera that the recording had created an irreversible breach of public trust. And while senators stood shoulder to shoulder before cameras, while the hashtags burned across every screen in America, and while chants echoed from courthouse steps and Capitol rotundas, Clarence Thomas said nothing. Not a word, not a line, not even a glance of acknowledgement. He remained perched on the bench like a man buried in his own myth, cloaked in silence so deliberate it no longer looked like control, it looked like collapse. AOC remained seated in the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her breathing shallow but steady, while Jasmine Crockett sat beside her like stone. They didn't speak either. They didn't need to, because the silence coming from the bench was now the loudest voice in the room. As pressure surged from every branch of government, across party lines, across state lines, across ideological lines, reporters camped outside the Supreme Court steps, waiting for any sign of movement, any shift in posture. Clerks were tight-lipped. Aides refused to comment. The court's marble facade, once imposing in its grandeur, now felt like a wall built not to protect justice, but to shield someone who had betrayed it. Then at 9:42 a.m. the next morning, a statement appeared on the Supreme Court's official website. It wasn't addressed to the public. It wasn't signed by any single justice. It was anonymous, cold, and clinical. The court is currently reviewing its internal procedures regarding evidentiary oversight and ethical review protocols. No further comment will be provided at this time. That was it. No denial, no clarification, no defense, just a fog of formality, strategically worded to say everything and nothing all at once. Within minutes, it was dissected across the nation. Legal experts called it non-committal to the point of insult. Ethicists branded it a masterclass in institutional evasion. Protesters called it what it was, cowardice behind marble. The anchors on every major network paused before reading it aloud, visibly hesitant, as if giving it voice lent it undeserved credibility. On MSNBC, a former federal judge shook her head live on air. "I've written 100 of these statements in my time. This one? It's a white flag without the courage to admit its surrender." But the country didn't need legalese to understand what was happening. People felt it, they saw it, they knew it. The man who had once sat atop the highest judicial pedestal in the land, cloaked in the sanctity of precedent and power, had been caught, and now he was hiding. And that hiding, that silence, was an answer. In law schools, professors changed their lesson plans to examine not just the ethics of power, but the anatomy of its unraveling. On social media, screenshots of the vague court statement were captioned with razor-sharp clarity. Translation: "We got caught. We're stalling. This isn't review. This is panic in a robe. He spoke on tape. And now the court has nothing to say?" Hashtags evolved into slogans. Slogans became chants, and chants soon turned into printed banners stretched across courthouse fences in cities from Chicago to Atlanta. "You said the quiet part. Now say goodbye. Recusal is not a consequence. It's a start." Outside Thomas's own home in Virginia, a quiet line of demonstrators stood holding candles by dusk. They didn't chant. They didn't scream. They just stood, row after row, holding in large quotes from his leaked audio, alongside the Supreme Court's deflective statement. One sign read, "You used the court to bury her. Now you've buried yourself." And still, Thomas remained silent. He did not recuse. He did not speak. He did not even release a second clarification. The courtroom remained technically open, but everyone understood. Its authority had been drained. The hearings no longer had the tone of a judicial proceeding. They had the tension of a crime scene waiting to be roped off. AOC, once the accused, now looked less like a defendant and more like a living rebuke. Her very presence was unbearable for those who had hoped she would fold. Jasmine Crockett's folder remained unopened on the desk before her, because she knew now that the evidence had spoken louder than any argument she could deliver. What followed in the hours after the court statement wasn't legal process. It was public reckoning. Editorial pages that had once defended Thomas's jurisprudence began to pull back. The Washington Post ran a front-page op-ed titled, "The Bench is Not a Throne." The Wall Street Journal, normally restrained, published a brutal centerfold graphic titled, "The Ethics That Vanished in One Sentence." Even longtime defenders of Thomas, clerks, scholars, conservative media figures, found themselves cornered. They tried to argue that the voice on the tape didn't technically admit to a crime, but those arguments wilted against the sheer force of public clarity. Because this wasn't about criminal law anymore. It was about trust. And trust, once broken at that altitude, doesn't get patched. It shatters permanently. A new phrase entered the political bloodstream: judicial integrity collapse. It was clinical, cold, and used with growing frequency by people on both sides of the aisle. The Supreme Court, which had for decades held an uneasy reverence as the last stop for moral arbitration, now found its name being spoken with open skepticism. A poll released that evening by Pew Research revealed that public trust in the court had dropped 21 points in 48 hours, the steepest decline since the 2000 Bush versus Gore decision. Legal historians called it a moment as devastating as the Dred Scott backlash, but born from within. Inside the Supreme Court itself, internal murmurs began to leak. Clerks were stunned. Some whispered that they hadn't known about the audio. Others admitted they'd heard rumors of overreach, but never imagined it would surface this way. One anonymous staffer was quoted saying, "We weren't prepared for the court to become the accused." And still, Thomas said nothing. No resignation, no apology, no movement. But perhaps that silence, rigid, hollow, defiant, was the most honest thing he could have offered. Because in that silence, the public no longer saw a figure of law. They saw a man exposed, a man whose decades of rulings, dissents, and speeches were now being replayed through a new lens. A lens cracked by 6 reckless words and the damning stillness that followed them. In homes across the country, families who had once ignored Supreme Court cases entirely now found themselves leaning over dinner tables, asking questions they never thought they'd have to. Can a judge be punished? What happens if the court is broken? How long has this been going on? And the answers, vague, incomplete, complicated, couldn't compete with the one thing that everyone now understood. The man in the robe had abused the silence entrusted to him, and now that silence was collapsing under its own weight. It wasn't just a fall from grace, it was a collapse of moral credibility, not just for Thomas, but for the symbol he once represented. And no carefully worded statement, no procedural delay, no strategic silence would be enough to put that symbol back together again. And as the silence around Clarence Thomas deepened into something darker than denial, the world turned to the woman who was supposed to be destroyed. The headlines that once screamed scandal now whispered retraction. The pundits who once scoffed now shifted in their chairs. The courtroom, once a cage built from doubt and accusation, had been forced open not by mercy, but by evidence, fury, and truth. And as the final procedural motions concluded behind closed doors, the decision was delivered without theatrics, just 3 lines on a printed statement. All charges dismissed, case deemed procedurally compromised. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is cleared of all wrongdoing. No applause erupted in the courtroom. No gavel struck with poetic justice, just stunned stillness, as if even the walls were embarrassed by the violence they had witnessed. AOC sat in her chair for a moment longer than necessary. Her legal team behind her quietly stood. Jasmine Crockett said nothing, only reached over and touched her elbow with calm assurance. The crowd in the gallery remained hushed, not from apathy, but reverence. They had just watched a public crucifixion undone. And for the first time since the ordeal began, AOC rose, not to defend herself, not to plead her innocence, but to walk forward, head high, shoulders squared, every step a defiance against the people who thought she wouldn't survive this. The press conference was called 1 hour later. Cameras were already in place, tripods jammed together like rifles pointed at a battlefield long after the war had ended. Outside the federal courthouse steps in Washington, D.C., a podium had been hastily erected, draped in the seal of the House Judiciary Committee. Behind it, 2 mics, just 2. No legal spokesperson, no PR manager, just AOC and Jasmine. When they stepped up to the microphones, the crowd hushed as if entering a cathedral. Reporters, seasoned and cynical, leaned forward. Not one of them expected what they saw. AOC in a plain navy suit, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a low bun. Jasmine beside her, arms behind her back. Expression composed like a closing argument waiting to be spoken aloud. AOC took a single breath and began. "There are moments in public life," she said, voice even, "when the price of telling the truth is not ridicule, it's retaliation." She paused, looking out into a sea of lenses and eyes. "And there are moments when the very system meant to protect justice instead tries to manufacture guilt." A flashbulb popped. No one moved. "I was charged," she continued, "not because I violated the law, but because I challenged those who abuse it. I was dragged through this not because I failed, but because I refused to fold. And now that the evidence has collapsed, now that we all know how this was orchestrated, I say this with no bitterness in my voice, only clarity. I was not charged because I was wrong. I was charged because I was right. Too early." The crowd didn't cheer. Not yet. The words were still too sharp, too fresh. They needed to land. She turned slightly, giving Jasmine the floor. Jasmine didn't step forward. She simply leaned toward the mic. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it cut through the air like a gavel of its own. "The truth," she said, pausing just long enough to command the weight of what followed, "is the strongest lawyer in any room." And with that, she stepped back. The press erupted, not with shouts, but with questions, hands flying upward, voices overlapping. But AOC didn't answer. She didn't need to, because everything that had to be said had already been spoken. And for the first time in weeks, not a single word of it was a defense. It was declaration. News anchors scrambled to react live. On CNN, a breaking lower third read, "AOC cleared. I was right too early." On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow wiped a tear from her cheek as she replayed Jasmine's quote. On Fox News, there was a long, unusually quiet pause. Outside the courthouse, the gathered crowd stood in the stunned silence for a beat, then slowly erupted. Not like a rally, not like a political celebration, but like a pressure valve releasing after days of holding its breath. A chant began, not rehearsed, not led, just rippling up from the back like a wave that had been waiting its turn. She stood, she stayed, she won. Truth speaks. Power breaks. Jasmine and AOC didn't wait for questions. They walked down the courthouse steps together. No security detail, no entourage. Just 2 women walking side by side through a world that had once tried to consume them and now had to face them. Behind them, the courthouse doors slowly closed, and inside those marble walls, the sound of power shifting was no longer metaphor. It was history, and the cameras had caught every second of it. And as Jasmine and AOC disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by chants and flashing cameras, the weight of their victory did not dissolve. It migrated from the steps of the courthouse to the granite corridors of Capitol Hill. Because this wasn't just about clearing a name anymore. It wasn't about a single injustice or a rogue voice caught on tape. It was about a system, one that had just proven how easy it was to twist the law into a blade and hand it to the powerful. 2 days later, room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building was standing room only. The sign outside the door read, Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitutional Integrity, Emergency Session. But everyone inside knew what it really was, the opening shot in a battle for judicial reform that had been delayed for decades. At the center of it sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, sleeves rolled up, not as a guest or a witness, but as the one who had written the resolution now sitting in front of the committee. The Independent Judicial Oversight Act of 2025, a single-page draft, plain language, no legal riddles, just one bold proposal: to establish an independent civilian body with investigative authority, empowered to review and hold accountable all federal judges, including justices of the United States Supreme Court. The room buzzed like a live wire. Across from her sat 12 members, 6 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 1 independent. Most were seasoned, all were wary. This wasn't a typical committee hearing. There were no lobbyists in the hallway, no staged handshakes. This was a breach in tradition, a direct challenge to a judicial branch that had long existed behind glass, above reproach. And yet here they were, not because of politics, but because Jasmine Crockett had made ignoring it impossible. She opened with no pleasantries. "I don't come here today for revenge," she said, voice calm but slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "I come here because last week we saw what happens when judges are allowed to operate in total darkness. We saw how easily the courtroom becomes a weapon when no one is watching the one holding the gavel." A few members shifted in their seats. Not out of disagreement, out of discomfort. "This proposal doesn't strip the courts of independence," she continued. "It doesn't politicize justice. It protects it. It protects people like Representative Ocasio-Cortez, like the clerk who risked their job to leak a recording, like every American who walks into a courtroom believing it's a place of truth, not theater." She stepped back. No slides, no charts, just words, just fire wrapped in precision. Congresswoman Lily Vaughn, a senior Republican from Indiana and longtime defender of judicial insulation, cleared her throat. "And what about separation of powers, Representative Crockett?" she asked. "What about preserving the impartiality of the bench?" Jasmine nodded. She had expected this. "Respectfully, Congresswoman, what we witnessed last week wasn't impartiality. It was unchecked authority. There is a difference. Impartiality is earned. Authority, when left unexamined, rots." The room fell still. From across the aisle, Representative Darnell Pierce, a moderate Democrat from Illinois, leaned into his mic. "What powers would this commission have exactly?" he asked. "And how would we prevent it from becoming just another partisan board?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. The commission would have subpoena power, access to financial disclosures, internal communications, and courtroom behavior reports. But its members would be selected through a bipartisan nomination panel, equal appointments from both chambers, plus 2 non-political civil rights attorneys selected through public bar associations. Term limited, transparent, auditable. Pierce nodded, slowly, thoughtfully. Then came the voice from the corner of the room. Congressman Adam Harkness, a libertarian-leaning independent and one of the sharpest legal minds in the chamber. "And if Justice Clarence Thomas is your case study," he said coolly, "are you suggesting this commission could have prevented what happened?" Jasmine leaned forward, eyes unwavering. "No, I'm saying it could have stopped it sooner, before the forged document reached the courtroom, before the audio file became the only line of defense, before trust in the Supreme Court became a national question mark." Harkness didn't argue. He didn't need to. The argument had already landed. Behind him, the gallery was packed. Law students, journalists, survivors of wrongful convictions, staffers who hadn't been born when Thomas was first appointed, but were now watching his legacy unravel in real time. And through it all, Jasmine never raised her voice. She didn't need volume. She had momentum. She had clarity. And most importantly, she had receipts. Every time a committee member tried to frame her proposal as radical, she returned to the same refrain. Then explain to me how what happened wasn't. By hour 2, even Vaughn, the Republican, softened. She didn't agree. Not yet, but she asked for a printed copy of the resolution. By hour 3, a staffer from the Senate Judiciary Committee was spotted slipping into the back of the room, clipboard in hand. It hadn't even passed the House yet, and the upper chamber had already begun monitoring the fallout. By hour 4, the chair of the subcommittee, Representative Ronald High, spoke into the mic, adjusting his glasses as he did. The chair moves that this resolution be scheduled for markup within 10 days. All in favor? 8 hands rose. It wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be, because for the first time in modern congressional history, a formal vote had been cast to bring the Supreme Court, not in front of cameras, not into culture wars, but under review. Outside the hearing, a reporter shouted, "Congresswoman Crockett, do you believe this vote was about Clarence Thomas?" Jasmine paused at the top of the stairs. She looked over the crowd, not with triumph, but with purpose. "No," she said, "this vote was about everyone who comes after him." And then she walked down the steps, each footstep echoing like the prelude to a system waking up from its own silence. And as the resolution moved forward and the Capitol slowly adjusted to its new fault lines, there remained a deeper current beneath all the hearings, headlines, and hashtags. A quiet reckoning that no vote could erase. Because this story was never just about one judge, one voice, or one courtroom. It was about how truth survives when the odds are rigged, how a woman accused for speaking too soon became the face of a system forced to listen, and how another woman, sharp, relentless, uninvited, walked into a space built to exclude her and broke it open with facts, not fury. The lesson wasn't wrapped in a speech or delivered in applause. It lived in the moments between, in Jasmine's silence before she spoke, in AOC's stillness while the world tried to unmake her, in the clerk's trembling hand pressing record. It was a reminder that justice doesn't arrive wearing robes. It walks in when the ones who've been pushed aside refuse to step back. And in that courtroom, beneath the stone and spectacle, the world saw a truth that couldn't be edited. The law means nothing without those brave enough to challenge it when it fails. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.